Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see people showing up. I can't tell, not so many people here today. Um, this is a funny Dharma talk. If I can find, yeah, there we go. So this is all Tony Head's fault, for which I think you'll thank him. I certainly do. And there's a chain of events that I have to explain, and I will. So in the fall of 1978, I was 47, and I had lived through the counterculture. I'd lived through drug addictions. I'd lived through parenting. I'd been married. I'd worked for Jerry Brown. A whole bunch of stuff had come to fruition. And in that year, I was asked to contribute to a magazine. It was being organized by Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Michael McClure. Lawrence runs a City Lights bookstore. He's the man that published Howl by Allen Ginsberg, a great patron of poets. Poets were actually allowed to steal books of poetry from City Lights bookstore. It's one of the great San Francisco institutions. And the momentum of my life had actually made me friends with Michael McClure and Lawrence and other people who were contributing to this book. Robert Aitken, who I studied with, Buddhist teacher, Gary Snyder, Robert Creeley, Ishmael Reed, Allen Ginsberg, Nanao Sakaki. And this invitation to me was like a milestone, looking back at, 40 years of my life, and I'd actually kind of, for the first time, felt like the person that I'd been aiming at. And this book was called The Journal for the Protection of All Beings. And I have a weekly session with a few friends, and we discuss Dharma issues and things. And last week, Tony Head brought this article by Gary Snyder called Buddhist Anarchism. And I thought, oh, gee, that's so familiar. I know that piece. I had no idea how I knew that piece, but I've read, I think, everything that Gary's written, except personal letters. So when I was thinking, we talked about it in our little group, and I was sort of fired up by it. And then I looked it up online, and old Zen master Uncle Dribble was totally surprised to find that he had contributed to it. I had completely forgotten, and I had completely forgotten that memory of how elated I was to be asked to contribute with all these worthies that I had looked up to and studied with from college onward, even before college. I'd been reading the Beat since I was 14 years old. So it was kind of a shock to be introduced into that group as a peer, maybe the junior member, but still, I was inside the covers. I wasn't just buying it. So that whole story, it was engendered or remembered because Tony read this article and brought it to our group. So I want to go through this article, and I'm going to read substantial quotes from it and talk about it, because I think it's kind of seminal, not only to the kind of practice that I do, but it gets at some real misunderstandings about the differences between spiritual and secular life, which are wrong. They're insubstantial. Like I've been criticized here before for talking politics when people want spirituality. So, if you want a morphine suppository, you have to ask your doctor. That's not what Buddhist practice is. And Buddhist practice is not to gain admission into some cotton candy idea of heaven where you feel good all the time. So I'm going to go through this as far as I can get today, paragraph by paragraph, and just talking about it. And you can find this online. It's called Buddhist Anarchism. It's by Snyder. It was written for this number 4 issue of the Journal for the Protection of All Beings. Itself a Buddhist conceit. So this was 44 years ago. So listen to it in that context. Some of it maybe is a little more radically tinged today than you or I would be comfortable with, but not much. And there's not much I can't think of anything I'm uncomfortable with. So here we go. So Buddhism holds that the universe and all the creatures in it are intrinsically in a state of complete wisdom, love, and compassion. Intrinsically, by their very nature. They're made up of that. Acting in natural response and mutual interdependence. Now, it certainly doesn't feel that way looking at the world, but that's what Buddha perceived when he understood the source of the material universe, what we call Buddha nature or Buddha mind, which is our actual self, not our personality, whether we know it or not. The personal realization of this from the beginning state cannot be had by and for oneself, because it's not fully realized until the self is given up and away. So, like probably all of you, I began my practice of Zen Buddhism looking for some release from difficult feelings and afflictions and suffering and stuff like that. And the contradictory nature of my thinking led me to imagine that enlightenment was other than all of those things, that there would be a fence that I would cross, I would hurdle onto the other side, and from that time my life would generate peace, harmony, goodwill with the reliability of an automobile engine. That's what I thought. And that's what got me to commit to sitting, and that's what got me to clean the toilets at Zen Center, and that's what got me to learn to not intrude my opinions when they weren't asked for in Zen Center, and to accept the strictures and the formal dress and the formal movements and the formal speech, because they were all designed to that end, to foster that. And they were extremely helpful. I don't discredit any of that. That's a monastic practice. My practice is a secular practice in the world. The personal realization of this from the beginning state of wisdom, love, and compassion cannot be had for and by oneself. So as long as we're thinking of ourself as an integer that's separate from the rest of the universe, we're out of luck. We sit on our cushion and we imagine ourself here and enlightenment over there. It's not going to work. We're not going to bring them together because we're operating and we've created a contradictory universe. Whereas the implications of what Buddha said, that the universe and all creatures in it are intrinsically in a state of complete wisdom, love, and compassion. That is a unity. Gary would say, the hawk, the swoop, and the rabbit are all one. So living that is the trick. You may get to perceive it for a minute, but the whole practice of Buddhism is based on that. The precepts, the Eightfold Path, you could say faking it till you make it, but they come from the product of an enlightened vision. And you can also say that following these precepts and the Eightfold Path is enlightenment. Hakuin, the great Rinzai Zen master, certainly said that. He had many, many kenshos in his life. But the final one, the one he related to as the root opening, was the revelation that the Eightfold Path itself is enlightenment. It's not a map to enlightenment. It's not a way to get enlightened. It is the recognition and the modeling of an enlightened life. So in the Buddhist view, what stops our manifestation of love, harmony, and compassion is ignorance. And what is the fundamental ignorance? The fundamental ignorance is thinking that we are only a separate and individuated self, separate from the rest of the universe. This tiny, meaningless little fingernail on Paul Bunyan. It's not that we're not an individuated form and awareness. It's not that we're not an unreplicable event of the universe. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story you've heard me mention many, many times. None of us have been separate from oxygen, from water, from sunlight, from the microbes that grow our food. So from that perspective, we're all ticks on the body of a dog. We're the ticks, we're the dog, we're the body. It's one thing. It's not a contradictory universe like the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are all contending with good and evil, God and man, matter and spirit. Never gets together. This is a really important paragraph. Historically, Buddhist philosophers have failed to analyze out the degree to which ignorance and suffering are caused or encouraged by social factors. Buddhist philosophers have failed to analyze out the degree to which ignorance and suffering are caused or encouraged by social factors, considering fear and desire to be given facts of the human condition. Consequently, the major concern of Buddhist philosophy is epistemology, which means theories of knowing, how we know what we know. Think of a grad student writing a PhD thesis on knowing. And psychology, with very little attention paid to historical or sociological problems. Now, Western Buddhism has certainly adjusted to that, and certainly people like Thich Nhat Hanh paid a lot of attention to social factors. And people like Alan Senauke, who's working in Burma. And many Buddhists have been sitting in front of nuclear power stations and taking a stand to register a Buddhist point of view to contradict the kind of problem that they're trying to solve, or to show an alternative to it. Buddhists don't yell and scream when they're on demonstrations. They sit zazen, but they register themselves, and they register themselves with dignity, and with respect for themselves, and with respect for others. It's very powerful. So Mahayana Buddhism, now this is Gary talking, Mahayana Buddhism has a grand vision of universal salvation. But when you look at what it's actually achieved, it's been practical systems of meditation, monastic situations, toward the end of liberating a few dedicated individuals from psychological hang-ups and cultural conditioning. In other words, for the millions and millions of people studying Buddhism, not so many enlightened souls. A lot of energy and effort going to teach this wisdom tradition, to introduce people to it. But when you look at the number of people compared to the population of the earth and compared to the problems of the earth, we need to do better. We need to do better if we're going to have an earth. So one of the reasons for this is that up until, I don't know, maybe the 16th century, before 16th century roughly, marking the European Enlightenment, the rise of science, the rise of a middle class, the rise of the importance of the individual, the rise of knowledge about how wealth is created. Before that time, there were serfs and there were rich people, and that was just the way things were. Kings were there by divine right, serfs were there by divine right, nobody knew much. By the time the Industrial Revolution came along, everybody could see how people got rich. And as the middle class began to develop, society began to expand and change. I read a book once in France about how the soloist in a symphony orchestra actually represented the rise of the middle class. It was a political accommodation. Heretofore, it had been the conductor, who was the king, and the symphony orchestra, that was the people. And now the emergence and the growing power of the middle class led composers to write for solos and for soloists to be out there representing that point of view. It's a pretty interesting thesis. So, however, from 2500 BC up until the 15th century or so is a long time. And under all that time, Buddhism was a patron of the state. Buddhism was under the power of the state. And the teachers and the masters did what they had to do to keep their institutions alive and well. And it didn't always work. There were great pogroms against the Buddhists where they were executed and, things would go back and forth. But during that period, Buddhism was quite willing to ignore or accept the inequalities and the tyrannies of whatever political system it found itself under. It just kept its mouth shut, and it kept looking at the business of enlightenment and transmitting wisdom and doing what it had to do. And I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming, it's like blaming your grandfather who did something or your great-great-grandfather who did something. I wasn't there. I'm sure that everybody who stood up too much was killed, just like black leaders in America who stand up too much. They don't live long. So this is a great paragraph. Well, so Gary points out that this acceptance of political repression and tyranny is death to Buddhism, because it's death to any meaningful functioning of compassion. And wisdom without compassion never feels pain. Wisdom is just like the clear sailing of the intellect, but it's actually compassion that grounds us to the suffering of other people and the suffering of other forms of life. It's what tempers our wisdom. It's what warms it up. Wisdom is cold steel. It's like a razor blade. And in some degree it can be pitiless. But it's compassion which warms it up and shows it what to cut and what not to cut, what to nurture. So this is a paragraph that to me is kind of extraordinary for having been written 48 years ago. I'm going to read it. No one today can afford to be innocent or indulge themselves in ignorance of the nature of contemporary governments, politics, and social orders. No one can afford to be innocent or indulge themselves in ignorance. The national politics of the modern world maintain their existence by deliberately fostering craving and fear. It's a monstrous protection racket. The free world has become economically dependent on a fantastic system of stimulation of greed, which cannot be fulfilled, sexual desire, which cannot be satiated, hatred, which has no outlet except against oneself, the persons one is supposed to love, or the revolutionary aspirations of pitiful, poverty-stricken marginal societies like Cuba or Vietnam. The conditions of the Cold War have turned all modern societies, communist included, into vicious distorters of man's true potential. They create populations of preta, hungry ghosts with giant appetites and throats no bigger than needles. The soil, the forests, and all animal life are being consumed by these cancerous collectivities. The air and water of the planet is being fouled by them. 48 years ago. So in the 60s, I never saw people really wearing branded clothing much. You know, a t-shirt for Chanel that costs $200 is made in the same factory in Indonesia or Burma that a white Hanes t-shirt for $6 or $10 is made. And the branding of that t-shirt with the name Chanel is kind of a hypnotic device to assert taste and class loyalty, status, all sorts of stuff. And the very fact that it's $200 reassures the people who buy them that they are in an elite and a select view. It's like these blue jeans you see that are brand new and they have huge holes worn out of them. Only rich people can afford that. Can afford pants which are just social statements. It's either disguising their wealth because they're afraid of the poor, or they're disguising themselves to fit into their idea of a proletariat. But it's all related to an economic system that's based on greed and fear of losing social standing and status. And it's worth some daily time spent to looking at the semenology. That's what the study of symbolic meaning in products and things is called, the signals they sent. It's worth some time walking through the world and looking at the way that we check out people's clothing for class and status and wealth and power. They say that by the time a child is in grade school, he or she has seen over 1 billion advertising images. And these images are not innocent. These images have been the product of billions of dollars of research. Billions of dollars of research, and checking them out with focus groups to see what moves people. When you see an advertisement of handsome, happy people drinking liquor on television or selling medicine or, these are all deeply calibrated to make you either fear for your health or fear for social exclusion, want something, want to be like these people. They're offered as a model of physicality, model of good looks, usually based on Western European Anglo vision. Now, advertisers are far more liberal than Congress. I mean, they're understanding that, black people buy products and Latin people buy products and Asian people buy products. But this is what's meant by a protection racket. The army's protecting us from Putin. The cops are protecting us from criminals. All we have to do is pay and shut up. But the actual reasons for the conflict are never up for grabs to citizens. The free world has become economically dependent on a fantastic system of stimulation of greed which cannot be fulfilled. There's always a new iPhone. There's always a new app. There's always a new product. Anything. If you don't look at your phone will call you. TikTok will say, oh, somebody's dating your girlfriend. Unless you turn those things off, your phone, your computer will be controlling you. That's not an accident. That's not for your convenience. That's because they get paid by the number of seconds that you watch your screen. Sexual desire which cannot be satiated. The pornography industry is a billion-jillion dollar industry. People can say what they want about it, but it's one of the most popular things on the internet. And the same thing with advertising using sexual stimulation. I mean, we're hardwired to it. You can't not look at a desirable young woman or a desirable young man. And that desire is based on often racial stereotypes, virility, sufficiency as breeding stock. And believe me, it's been studied. It's been studied and designed to get your attention. And we all participate in it. It's not like by seeing through this, I'm exempt from the consequences. Unless I stop every day and remind myself, oh yes, beauty, they sell soap with it. They sell perfume with it. They sell status with it. They sell political inclusion with it. Unless I do that, believe me, I'll be fiddling and buying some piece of crap on my telephone. The conditions of the Cold War have turned all modern societies, communist included, into vicious distorters of man's true potential. They create populations of pretas, hungry ghosts with giant appetites and throats no bigger than needles. That's one of the round of lives in Buddhist philosophy. The top of the circle is called the heaven realm. You think of, Brad Pitt and these kind of people with the best of everything. The best food, the best toys, the best men and women. Everything's gorgeous, everything smells good, everything's clean, everything's lovely. But inherent in it is the fear of losing it. So you can't be enlightened from that realm. Then the next realm are called Asuras. And they're very brilliant, very powerful, very jealous beings. Think of politicians. Always planning, plotting against one another. How do we undo you? How do we undo this? How do we take our revenge? How do we stop the president from getting a Supreme Court justice? That's his right. How do we block the Democrats from feeding the poor? All these kind of things. These are the realms of Asuras. And you can't be enlightened from this realm either, because all you're thinking about is competition and jealousy. The next realm is the human realm, and that's where we all live. That's a world of struggle, of dukkha, illness, birth, death, grieving, situations we don't want, situations we do want that we can't hold on to forever. And that's the realm that you can be enlightened from. That's the only one. And that's why they talk about why having a human body is so important, because the entire mix is there and you can see your way through it. You're not so attached. There's such a meld of suffering and reward and joy and sorrow that you actually can learn stability within it. Then after the human realm comes the animal realm. And that's the realm of hunt, kill, or be killed. And there are animals like that. That's the predominant state of animals. There are people like that. We move through these circles. We may move many times a day. We may be in one or another. Other people are predominantly in those areas. Then after the animals, there's the hungry ghosts. Those are the pretas, with giant appetites and throats no bigger than needles. The image is their mouths are the size of suitcases and the throats are the size of needles. They can never consume enough. And then finally there's the hell realm, in which people are suffering so much that the thought of enlightenment, the thought of purity just can't get through. This is another great quote. This is important to remember. We say, well, this is the way things are. This is the way things are. Why swim against the stream? The nail that sticks up gets pounded down. But Gary reminds us, there is nothing in human nature or the requirements of human social organization, which intrinsically requires that a culture be contradictory, repressive, and productive of violent and frustrated personalities. It's worth saying again. There is nothing in human nature or the requirements of human social organization which intrinsically requires that a culture be contradictory, repressive, and productive of violent and frustrated personalities. There have been many findings in anthropology. They have found Neanderthal graves where the bodies in them have survived grave injuries. Injuries where they could only survive had they been taken care of by others. Those graves are filled with flowers and pollens of flowers and all sorts of offerings. So as far back as humans go, we can say that we are equally genetically directed towards compassion and caring for one another as we are toward violence. We can't say it's human nature because human nature includes Martin Luther King Jr. and Donald Trump and Malcolm X and Bishop Tutu and Mother Teresa and you and me and everyone else. So human nature is no nature. Human nature is formless. It can't be selectively segregated for the trait that you want and say, oh yes, I'm a greedy pig because it's just human nature. Look around you. Well, that's just selection. You can prove this for yourself by meditating. When you meditate, you can reach the full potential of what your inner life is. And then you can drop right through your personality. And you can get some inkling and some idea of what Buddha nature is, what it feels like. You can't live there all the time, but you can taste it, you can sense it, you can see it. Suzuki Roshi called this letters from emptiness. Everything was a letter from emptiness. So in the light of this, you can see how radical Buddha's renunciations were. Before Buddha recited, not the Heart Sutra, one of the earliest sutras, he went into town and he begged for his daily meal. And then he's described as coming back, washing his bowl and his feet and hands, plumping up his pillow, and then sitting down and giving a Dharma lecture. So what's important about that is that the Buddha lived by the same standard he held his disciples to. And that standard was a renunciation of security, of wealth, of status, of power. Now, it's true he had an advantage. He was a prince. He knew how to move in the royal realms. He knew how to talk to those people. But what did he get from those people? He got deer parks and places where his disciples could sit in safety and study. He didn't have a castle. He didn't live in the Vatican. He didn't have gold and jewels in his robes. So there is a radical edge to Buddhism which cuts through all the presuppositions of everyday society. On some levels, perhaps monks come closer to that, but monks alone don't make up a society. And so those of us that are secular practitioners, those of us who follow the image of Vimalakirti, and for those who may not know who that is, Vimalakirti was reputed to be second in wisdom only to the Buddha, a contemporary of the Buddha. And there's no Buddhist temple in Japan that doesn't have a picture of Vimalakirti with a full head of hair in layman's clothing. Whether he was an actual person or whether he was invented by Mahayana Buddhists as an example of how you could live, doesn't matter. And that's the lineage that I work in. My teacher group was called Vimala Sangha. Still exists in Mill Valley. So as secular practitioners, we have a little more difficult line to follow. We have kids in school, we have houses sometimes, we have rent to pay, and you can look at that as an indulgence, or you can look at that as giving us the opportunity to understand what it is that afflicts everyone. And for those of us that have been given good educations and taught to analyze and taught to study history and social forms and political forms, why wouldn't it be an adjunct of our work to spread that information and to critique those forms which are increasing suffering? For instance, a political system organized around money, which is what ours is. It's organized around the collection, the hoarding, and the spending of money. And consequently, the needs of money trump the needs of people. So money dictates that everybody can have an AR-15. And we're not going to do anything to stop these weapons from being in the hands of insane people. We're not doing background checks. As a matter of fact, we're selling silencers, we're selling armor-piercing bullets. Why? Because the lobby of the weapons industry in the United States is buying the Congress. Why? The congressmen have to be bought to get in office, the good ones and the bad ones. The bad ones just open the suitcases. The good ones are making terrible choices. If I don't give a little to the devil, I won't stay in office to fight for the rights of women, to fight for the environment, to protect the air, water, land, and soil. But the root of that problem is that the system is based on money. There are other ways to do it. You can have a system where the people pay for the elections. Each candidate gets their own amount of money, gets the same amount of money. Doesn't have to be legal for corporations to be able to spend their treasure influencing public policy for the benefit of their shareholders. It doesn't have to be legal that lobbyists are allowed to give money, trips, emoluments, speaking fees, publishing the books to legislators. The implication of nirvana is that in the very next instant, you can do something new. That's what freedom is. In the very next instant, you can look and see it anew. So in a world that's based on formless energy, there's nothing fixed. There's no institution that's fixed. It's a habit. And we can begin to analyze it, educate people how it operates, resist it, and try to change it. But you can only do that if you're willing to sacrifice, to some degree, your own comfort and indulgence. To say that this self, this idea of who I am, this fiction that's been developed over my lifetime, doesn't really have an independent existence, fundamentally. And I'm not going to escape the suffering of the world unless I help others. It's like the vaccines. Unless we vaccinate the entire world, we are vulnerable. So I think that's enough for today. I'm going to pick this up in my next Dharma talk. I love this thing, this essay. And if you're still there, thank you very much. I'll say the metta prayer, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Thank you all very much for showing up today, and I'll look for you next time. Thanks. Please take good care of yourselves. Wear a mask. Get vaccinated and boosted.